Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us for another edition of Hold My Drink, where we navigate the news and politics with a chaser of civility. I'm your host, Jen, inviting you to grab your favorite beverage, sit back, and imagine with us how to create a new American identity together. Welcome to this week's Hold My Drink podcast. I am in a room of amazing people right now. I have got both my co-hosts, W.F. Twyman Jr., who goes by Wink, and David Bernstein, who goes by David. And we have Izabella Tabarovsky. I said that right?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Perfect pronunciation.
Thank you. I try. Someone who speaks Chinese, it's really important to me to say names correctly. But Izabella, she is a writer, a researcher with the Kenan Institute at the Wilson Center. She focuses on politics, historical memory, particularly in the former Soviet Union. And we invited Izabella on. Wink and I in particular are in love with some of her work, including the American Soviet mentality. But before we get there, this conversation needs a drink.
For sure.
Izabella, you first. Did you bring something to the table?
I'm being very Russian here. I'm drinking tea. Although, unlike a typical Russian, I'm not drinking a black tea. I'm drinking herbal tea. Tulsi, it's really lovely. I highly recommend it. I have a whole thermos with me here because I know it's going to be a long conversation. So,
David, what about you? Anything to the table?
Yeah, I brought bourbon, and I know you always think of me as a Scotch drinker, but I'm going with bourbon these days. Trying to get used to it.
I think Wink has brought bourbon to the table before.
I have. I have on occasion, but today I have a nice celebratory mimosa. So
beautiful.
Yeah.
Okay.
Wonderful.
I have to tell you, I'm a little disappointed in all of you because I brought the most Russian drink to the table. I brought vodka.
Good for you.
However, I must make a confession. It is watermelon vodka. And I'm pretty sure that I would be shamed out of any true Russian bar drinking watermelon vodka. So
no Russian has ever drank watermelon vodka.
Yeah, I'm not sure I've ever tried that. So, wonderful.
Cheers, y'all.
Cheers.
So, Izabella, we got in touch, and our first kind of question for you, and this really goes to I'll let Wink start. But as you know, Wink and I started the Alternative 1619 Reading Guide. And we took the 1619, the Pulitzer Center created a curriculum around the 1619 project. So we took that on and we created a master document, but then we broke it down into bite-sized pieces, essay by essay. So read this, but also read that. Read this, also read that. Well, day one for the centerpiece, Nicole Hannah-Jones article on the idea of America, we paired your piece, the American Soviet mentality. And a lot of people have asked us why. And I've got to tell you, that was Wink's decision. So I'm going to let him take lead here. But when he told me why, I was 100% on board. I thought it was a brilliant why. And so with that, I'm going to let Wink explain why we chose your essay to pair with Nicole Hannah-Jones' primary essay for the 1619 project, and then take it from there. So Wink, shoot.
Sure. Thank you for that introduction, Jen. It struck me as I began to read the centerpiece for the 1619 project. The thing that struck me was what I thought was a accusatory tone. The very first sentence reads, "Our founding ideals of liberty and equality were false when they were written, period." And right away I thought, well, the idea of liberty and equality goes back to Greek times. It goes back to the Bible. So it's an apprehension or misperception to say those ideas were false, because if you believe in the true history of those ideas, they've been there before the beginning even of the U.S. as a country, before the beginning of England as a country. They go back to ancient times. And so that misperception of those ideas disturbed me. And as I read more, my sense of the accusatory tone continued. But then I read last year a piece by Izabella. And, it's interesting. When I listen to music, there's music that takes me away. I feel the music is aligned with the universe and how things are. When I read the 1619 centerpiece, I didn't feel that sense of alignment or harmony. I wasn't taken away. If anything, I felt that sense of mild disaffection or concern, apprehension, even in terms of demonization of people, of prominent cultural figures. But when I read Isabella's piece, it was like listening to great music, like Mandolin Rain by Bruce Hornsby and the Rage. And every paragraph, every sentence seemed to articulate the fears and anxieties I had about what was implicit in the 1619 project. I want to say, and then read a short quote from her piece, but I want to say that the cautionary tone I found in Isabella's piece beautifully captured my apprehensions and anxieties. We can't weaponize past evil in service of a future American Soviet. Can't do that. And what Isabella wrote rang true to me. And she wrote, all of us who came out of the Soviet system, there are scars of the practice of unanimous condemnation. Whether we ourselves had been targets or participants in it or not. It is partly why Soviet immigrants are often so adverse to any expressions of collectivism. We have seen its ugliest expressions in our own lives, and our friends, and our families' lives. It is impossible to read the chastening remarks of Soviet writers, from whom Boris Pasternak had been a friend and a mentor, without a sense of deep shame. Shame over the perfidy and lack of decency on display. Shame at the misrepresentations and perversions of truth. Shame at the virtue signaling and the closing of rank. Shame over the momentary and we now know of mediocrity over talent. And to me, in the past year or two, that spoke more to the cautions I had underneath the 1619 project than anything else I had read. And so I want to conclude by hoping that somewhere out there is a Black American Boris Pasternak, that there is someone who will bring forth into the world poetry and perhaps a novel that will show the strength and the beauty of the individual in a world of developing activism. And that's why I chose her piece as the centerpiece.
What do you think, Isabella?
Well, first of all, thank you for your incredibly beautiful words and for understanding, really. I think that paragraph really expresses also the core of my anxiety over what I see developing in the United States over the last year. I think it's become really prominent mostly. What we see on social networks so often, right? It's the collective demonization. It's the closing of rank. It's when people lose their jobs, people are demonized, their reputations are taken away from them, their ability to pursue their careers is taken away from them. That I find really frightening, because for me, it's all too real coming from Soviet history. And that's why I use that example with Pasternak, because I think his example is one that I think pretty much every Russian can relate to and knows very well, because many Soviet writers were demonized in Soviet times for wrongthink, right? For disagreeing with the main line, with whatever was culturally acceptable at the time, whatever was ideologically acceptable at the time. So they would be demonized, they would be brought down. But with Pasternak, it was so prominent. It was so, because he was a figure of such stature, right? Because he was a Nobel Prize winner. And it's very interesting. I don't think I included it in the piece. But actually, if you go to the Wikipedia pages of the writers who participated in demonizing him, they will actually say participated in the demonization of Pasternak. It's so important. It's become so important that people actually, it's become part of their biographies. And so the cautionary tale for me also is for those who are joining in the sort of in the collectivist mentality and in the choirs of that keep affirming the same ideas over and over and over and shutting down other ideas. They also have to know that, we don't actually know what will happen in the long term, and history will kind of make its judgment in the longer term than in the here and now. And so if you are denouncing others, if you are participating in these rights, you have to, it's just bad karma, and you have to know that it will be remembered, maybe not necessarily in your Wikipedia page, but somewhere else it will somehow be remembered. So that's kind of.
Didn't read, but disapproved. That was one of my favorite takes from your essay.
Yeah, exactly. Because you couldn't, you wanted to distance yourself from the seditious material. You didn't want to be shown to have read something that's so dangerous and obviously culturally toxic, yet you wanted to express your disapproval. And I think that we see this happening. It's happening in our culture here as well.
Thomas Sowell, Shelby Steele, Glenn Lowry, John McWhorter, Coleman Hughes. These are writers, great intellectuals, for whom I think many people would say, didn't read, but disapprove, nonetheless.
Fascinating.
Well, I was telling Wink, Izabella, this really, the 1619 project that we are working on right now. I actually am going to quote you in an essay that I'm working on, because I read pieces of it, but I didn't read the whole thing. Now I am. We're doing this project. I'm part of it, but it really rang true to me, because there are parts, in my opinion, of the 1619 essay that are of value, but only if I believe that they are shown with other things as well, which is exactly what Wink and I are trying to do, like where we're providing that critical thought. But until Wink and I got on this project, I wrote a lot and talked a lot about the 1619 project without having really read it. I read pieces of it. Again, I'll give myself a little credit. I did not read it, but going day by day, like we're doing now, I hadn't done. And so I think that I'm really actually excited to write this kind of finale piece when we're done, because I have learned so much. And I was, telling Wink this as well. And Wink can speak for himself, but as he always says, there are 40 million Black Americans. What they offered was one voice. What Wink offers is one voice, but it's a different voice. And so you've got to be able to hear those voices in tandem.
Absolutely. And the thing that people also don't understand, I think, sometimes when I look at it, is there is a certain ideology that's coming together, right? We don't quite know what to call it. You can call it woke ideology, whatever it is. It's not, I think it requires much understanding still and much research in order to really understand what it's about. But what people don't understand is when you adopt a certain ideology and you speak it, you speak in slogans, because that's what I'm starting to see now. People are speaking in slogans. What they don't understand, it's very exciting at the beginning of a revolution when you have certain slogans, they give you moral clarity, you keep putting them into your discourse and the world is clear, right? Everything is clear. But then after a while, these slogans become very stale. And you can force people into repeating them. They can keep repeating them. In the 70s and 80s, 50, 60 years after the revolution, people were still repeating the slogans, but they didn't mean them, and they thought something completely different. And you didn't really know, because only one form of discourse was allowed, you didn't really know what people thought until it all began to unravel. And one of the reasons why, there were many reasons why it began to unravel, but one of the reasons is because it became so hollowed out. Nobody believed in anything anymore, right? You couldn't believe in these slogans anymore. So there is, I think that people who are insisting on all of us kind of speaking the same slogans, they're already planting the seeds of their own destruction. And the question for me is only, how long will it take? I sure hope it's not going to take 70 years, the way it took the Soviet Union. And here, of course, America is obviously not the Soviet Union. Americans are not used to being told what to think and say. And it's taking a little bit of time, but I think the dissenting voices are coming together, and people will be finding their courage, right, and their footing in how to oppose it without being shot down as racists and whatever people are saying these days. It may take a little bit of time, and maybe in the short term, the ideology will win. But I think my great hope for America, my belief in America, is based on the fact that people here are used to having free speech, free conscience, and it's just not going to last that long. But for that, we all have to speak out. We have to keep bringing out our opposition to it.
Yeah, and that brings
That's a very good point.
Go ahead.
I think people sometimes will just choose to conform because either it preserves harmony, or it's an easier path to take, or it's a surefire way to get clicks or career advancement. And I am not an angel. I am not a saint. I too have chosen the way of the coward. I'll give you a great example. Someone who I will not name, who I know, wore a Black Lives T-shirt in my presence a few days ago, and I found that very annoying. But I didn't say anything because one has to pick and choose their battles. And would the harm to the relationship be worth the candle in that context? Probably not. So I chose to stay quiet. But what happens when not tens of people, but hundreds of thousands and millions of Americans choose the same choice on matters of more importance than whether someone chose to wear a Black Matters T-shirt? I think that's the real danger, is that people will just decide, it's better to live in harmony than to stick my neck out and be one among the collective. That's why I find Boris Pasternak so inspiring. I mean, this, Izabella, I'm sure. He was denied effectively the ability to accept a Nobel Prize for literature, I think in 1958 or 59, I forget. And he was demonized by his fellow Soviet writers. But Izabella mentions the word karma. Things have a way of circling around, don't they? I think since the year 2011, maybe, or 2013, Dr. Zhivago has been a required part of the curriculum in the 11th grade in Russia. Think about that. How the circle has changed. And so my hope, Izabella, is that we will reach the point where one day those who are silenced in the here and now will be part of the curriculum in the future.
America's perestroika and glasnost will come. I sometimes think about it as I hear about yet another movie that's being shelved, or another book that's not being published. And I think, what? I don't mind dating myself because I need to be making these points. I lived through the time when perestroika and glasnost came. And for those people for some people, this is ancient history. So I will say that was the period when Mikhail Gorbachev launched kind of the opening. Glasnost was the opening when all of a sudden you could actually publish controversial material or criticism of the party. And that's when I think around 87 or so, they started to publish all of these books that had been prohibited for years and decades. And, Solzhenitsyn, Vasily Grossman, just all of the greats that we couldn't read. And, here's the thing about that time. I was a teenager then. And I remember that people were just drunk on kind of this. It was so cathartic, and people were drunk on the truth that was suddenly coming out, that they suddenly could read these things. Some of them were just shocking, but just the idea that all of a sudden you had access to this information. And I frankly, when I moved to the US, we came to the US in 1990. I remember taking a class. It was either undergrad or graduate school, I don't remember, but a class in the history of Western thought, I think something like that it was called. So there was philosophy and there were novels. You could choose what you wanted to read. It was, I think, 2 semesters long. And I remember encountering this material for the first time and just thinking, literally feeling angry that all of this had been withheld from me for all of these years. I thought, gosh, I would have been a different person if I had encountered these ideas at an earlier age. So what I'm saying is that, you know, when things that were prohibited are suddenly allowed back again, it's an incredible feeling. This moment will come.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
But I don't, you know, what worries me is we're seeing the opposite of glasnost right now, and I want to bring David into this as well, because you know we are kind of narrowing acceptable viewpoint diversity. So I don't know how far we have to narrow it until there is that kind of, you know, explosion of other voices. We're seeing, I feel like, and David, I'll let you speak for yourself. I feel like we do see a trickling of people pushing back. I mean, you've got organizations like David Wink and I all collaborate with Counterweight. And so you've got Counterweight, you've got your organization FAIR, Foundation Against Intolerance and Racism. You've got the 1776 Unite. So you do see these organizations kind of bubbling up, but it's so loud out there. And I just, you know, and it is like Wink said, you know, sometimes it is just easier to keep quiet. And so, David, do you want to talk a little bit about viewpoint diversity and your concerns on where we're at in America on that scale?
Yes, I do. But first, I want to come clean for a second. And that is that since you introduced me to Izabella by recruiting her for this podcast, the two of us have been talking behind the scenes. And so much so that we've been collaborating on a joint essay. And the funny thing is, we were trying to figure out how to weave together both of our personal narratives. And Izabella sent me this morning an article that the two of you wrote about your personal narratives. So as an example of how we might be able to weave our own personal narratives together. So watch out. You know, Izabella and David may be the next, you know, Jennifer and Wink here. Okay, so so you know, we've been thinking a lot about these challenges and arising from our own immigrant experiences. Izabella is an immigrant herself. My mom is from Baghdad, Iraq, and I grew up in an immigrant-infused household with all the attitudes of immigrants who have found this country an amazing place and could contrast it from their experience growing up. My mom in Baghdad, Iraq, where there was, you know, periodic oppression, really, of the Jewish community there. And I think one of the things, and I really want to explore this with Izabella, it's not exactly viewpoint diversity, but I'm sure we're going to get there, is this idea that America is being portrayed as this sort of supremacist state in the current discourse. It's this, and you would think if you didn't know anything else about the world, that America was probably one of the most repressive places on earth. If you just listened or read the critical social discourse and ideology on this, you might think America was really unique in its horrors. And I wanted to ask you, Izabella, what from your experience gives you a different view of America, and how do you think you can help Americans think about their own experience in this country?
Well, look, I mean, when I first came here, I sort of understood early on. Look, I came from behind the Iron Curtain. I think it's something that is almost very hard to understand today, right? Given how interwoven we all are. You come from behind the Iron Curtain. It's like the only comparable experience, I think, is one today that North Korean refugees have, the ones who managed to flee from North Korea, because you're so completely cut off from the rest of the world. I mean, we knew nothing about the West, really, except for just a few things that would kind of seep in. You know, some people managed to listen to foreign broadcasts, but it was hard. Not everybody could do it. And so America just blew you away, you know, in the first instance by its incredible abundance, of everything. You came from a shortage economy, like was, Soviet economy, and you walk into an American supermarket, and it may seem really banal and really superficial, but it's not really, because if you're living in a situation of shortage, all of your life is dedicated to getting your basic needs met. Your whole life is dedicated to standing in lines to get this piece of cheese, and then you go to another store and maybe they have a piece of sausage over there, and so you stand in another line. And then you need to buy, I don't know, school uniform, and where do you get it? So your dad goes, flies to Moscow because maybe over there they have them. So that was like, wow, this is incredible. And they told us about rotting capitalism and how everything is horrible here, but obviously it's working just fine. And from that first instance, you also realize that in this country, you're actually responsible for yourself. You have to be making choices on a daily basis. Nobody is going to define your course for you. Just like you have to know how to pick one sort of milk out of 20 on the supermarket shelf, you also then have to make choices about which school do you go to, which profession do you want to choose, which career, right? Like you're making choices all the time from a situation where you had no choices. That's a really radical thing. It begins to change you. But I also understood very early on that I had to just understand the system, because the system was so radically different. And the system blew me away. Like the idea of, I think that it's like the idea of due process, the idea of presumption of innocence, coming from a country where all of this was so abused, right? Where millions of people were repressed. All of a sudden you see this, you're like, wow, this is incredible. And a person has a right to face their accuser in a court of law. What an incredible concept. It's like, I think I understood it very early on that it was a real bulwark against abuses of an individual, right? Against this kind of systemic abuses. So that was incredible to me. Reading the Declaration of Independence was incredible to me. I mean, that you have a right, like it's your natural right to pursue happiness. It's like, wow, what an incredible concept. So it was things like this. And then, of course, freedom of conscience, freedom of speech, that you actually you could speak your opinion out loud and nobody would, you're not supposed to be punished for it. That blew me away. And it was very hard for me. Like some of these things were very hard for me. The idea that, for example, that you should, like the idea that you have to vote no matter, like even if you know that your elected representative will not be elected, but you still need to go and vote. Like that was completely unintuitive for me. Why should I go vote? Because when you come from a country where you didn't have a right to vote, or rather, it was just sham elections with one candidate and everybody they tried to get to 100% representation. Anyway, so it was incredible to me. So as I've seen over the last few months and maybe a year since I started paying attention to it, when you look at how people are denounced, nobody is looking at the actual merits of a case. They don't even have a right to defend themselves. The court of public opinion makes a decision on on the merits, and they're just out. I mean, to me, that just that devalues and removes some of the really incredibly critical parts of the American system that other countries don't have and wish they had. Sorry, it's long and confusing. But...
No, it's incredible. So I want to follow that up. I had the honor of being in a conversation with Garry Kasparov, the world-renowned chess player and democracy advocate. And we were talking about comparative reasoning when it comes to assessing America. And one thing he pointed out, and we agreed on this, that some of the voting laws that were introduced in certain states like Georgia, we both agree were problematic. I mean, the voter ID laws and the sort of restrictions on mail-in voting were problematic. They made it harder for certain people to vote. In a country like ours, we want more people to vote. That said, and he pointed out, that doesn't mean that the United States is like China and its onslaught on Hong Kong. They're not in the same league. I mean, there's a fundamental undermining of the democratic system that was Hong Kong. And that's not the case in Georgia. No matter how much we might decry what Georgia just passed on voting rights, it ain't what China did with Hong Kong. And how does, I guess the question I have is, how does that inform, if you agree with me, maybe you don't, but how does that inform the way we think about change in America and what needs to happen here?
Wow, that's change. What kind of change? Like, what are you talking about?
So, if America is an imperfect country, right? I think we could all agree on that. Like every country is imperfect, and many of us want to make it better, right? We're committed to making it better, making it more equal, reducing disparity, and the rest. But there's a comparative context when we look at other countries and what they've done. And in some of those countries, you can argue that the system is so rotten to the core that they need to be sort of replaced on a wholesale basis. But in the United States, I think at least it's not so bad. There's problems, there are disparities, there are things that need to be fixed. How does what we understand in the behavior of a Soviet Union or former Soviet Union inform how we think about change in the United States, about how we might repair the problems in this country?
Well, look, I think that this country has mechanisms for change, and we want to change. What I disagree with is that we need a revolutionary change. When people come in and say that we have to sweep all of it and raise it to the ground and start anew, I mean, that's where I ask myself, well, what do you mean? I mean, the thing is, again, like my Soviet background it tells me, we had a violent revolution in 1917. The idea that you had to raise that system to the ground was very popular then. What did we build instead?
Yeah.
It's always dangerous. And some people kind of dismiss this rhetoric a little bit, but I don't, because my experience teaches me that when radical people come in and tell you that they plan to make radical change, you listen to them and you believe them. I believe them. I believe the people who say that they want to just like radically revolutionize this system. And I just don't believe that that's what we want, because that can lead to disaster. I mean, I basically think that we have a system where change is possible. We should work within this system, and if we need to, let's change the system, but let's do it in a way that's that works for everyone.
Isabella, I want to ask you something I thought about. I came across an essay or an article you wrote in Newsweek. You talked about a phenomena which gave you caution, and it was the disappearance of Stalin and Stalin from the past. And that there seemed to be this idea that over time, younger generations were trying to forget the evil repression in the past under Stalin. And that you therefore, but nonetheless, people are curious. And so you had examples of some people who did genealogy or family history digging, and they would uncover relationships with people who had been agents of Stalin, who had been oppressors. And you mentioned some of the most profound and moving moments of healing when people came together that had that evil past. And you said there were people who didn't want to bring it up, didn't want to stir the pot, didn't want to disturb things. Do you see parallels between that and what we see in America with the psychology of Black Americans who are the descendants of American slavery? And what do I mean by that? Every Black American, prove me wrong, but every Black American is the descendant of slave owners and slaves in our past. To me, and from my reading, I find it very powerful to use family history as a way to reconnect with distant cousins who may be of a different race in terms of truth and reconciliation. I think there's a wonderful book, what is it? The Choice. It's back there somewhere. There's a wonderful book called The Choice by a doctor here in San Diego, La Jolla. She was a victim of the atrocities in Auschwitz. It's called The Choice. And throughout her life, where is that? I wish I could find it. Throughout her life, she didn't want to talk about it. She didn't want to talk about it. She kept it repressed psychologically. but only towards the end of her life did she decide that she needed to face it. She needed to face her demons. So she went back to Auschwitz to make her peace with the evil past, and it was very profound for her and very much a matter of healing. Do you think Black Americans who have the evil past of American slavery in their past, genetically, family-wise, should they try to replicate what that doctor did by returning to Auschwitz, or what people have done in Russia by reconnecting with people who were agents of the Stalinist past? Is real profound healing on an individual level as opposed to a collective level?
Well, look, I first of all, I want to say that I think it's almost a question that I want to address to you, because I think that that's it's an experience. I do, one of the things that I do believe in is that people who represent kind of the groups that were oppressed are perhaps the strongest spokespeople for that. Like, I feel comfortable speaking, for example, about on behalf of Jewish people, on behalf of people who were victims of Stalin's repressions, and I have somebody in my family who was a victim. So, in fact, in a way, I would actually love to hear what you think about it. I do think that there is, in general, value in reconciliation discourse, for sure. It's certainly, there were a lot of groups after the whole Soviet system, the socialist bloc collapsed and it became possible. There were a lot of reconciliation initiatives between Jewish groups and Polish groups, groups from Eastern Europe, in whose territory the Holocaust occurred, and there may have been collaboration. And I do find reconciliation initiatives very inspiring, because I think that at some point we have to get past the anger, and at some point we have to get past, and I'm now speaking as a Jew right now, right? So we have to get, look, with Germany has done so much to help achieve a reconciliation. I think it's always an example, really, of how it hasn't been perfect, but it's an amazing example of how a country can rectify the wrongs. It has to be done. I think it's with kind of the right kind of mediation, right? So that you do come to healing in the end. I do think that in the end, healing is really is the goal, because otherwise, where do we go from there, right? So, what do you think?
Well, you know what and I'm just thinking out loud. I unfortunately think so much of this is personality driven, personality based. So, for example, Jen and I hit it off. We work well together. And, to an outsider, you would think, well, how can that be? You're Black, she's white. You live in San Diego, she lives in Austin, Texas. How could that be? Your experiences are so different. They must be. Your past is so different. It must be. Au contraire. Au contraire. And I kind of return to Boris Pasternak in the sense that when we are at our most profound, right? When we are at our most spiritual as people, it's when we're most in touch with our individual self. And so I think personality is really your most individual self, is how you engage the world. So Jen and I have very complementary personalities, and I think that we work well together. Racial differences fall away. Gender differences fall away. Geographical differences fall away, because it's personality at the end of the day that matters. So similarly, with regards to racial reconciliation, I happen to be, who knows why, a very open-minded person. I'm a very curious person. I'm a very intuitive person. I love history. I mean, as you know from my writings, I grew up on a road in Chesterfield County called Twyman Road. Everyone on the street was Twyman. We were all family. We were all Black. It was like Mayberry, USA. But I remember as a tiny kid always having the curiosity, where did the name come from? Where did that name come from? And for over 50 years of my life, that kind of haunted me. It was almost like you were an orphan in a sense. And so I eventually found out, and I felt a sense of completion. And I felt driven to learn more about these people who shared my genetic makeup and my name and now my family history. But I sense, Izabella, and it so frustrates me, so frustrates me. I sense so many Black Americans, they carry in their heart, it's like structure of their being, resentment and grudge holding against people who may have been descendants of slave owners. Not to mention you yourself are, but put that aside for a moment. It just seems like it's part of how we create Black culture and consciousness, that part of the structure of being is to never let go of the evil past and to almost see modern day descendants of common ancestors as the walking evil if they happen to be white. And I just think that's just so problematic, but I think it's also personality. I think if you don't have a very curious, intuitive, open personality, you don't break through psychologically. And so it's more easy to view yourself as only having Black ancestors because everyone else feels the same way. It's what you know, it's comforting, and you don't have to challenge yourself. Think about that. I mean, it is a challenge. For most Black Americans, it is a challenge to accept and understand that you do indeed have cousins that are not Black. For example, I discovered, I think a few months ago, that I have a distant cousin from Serbia. I thought that was amazing. I thought that was great. I wanted to learn more. I was intrigued. How did that happen? I tell my family, nothing. Dead silence, flat. And I think a lot of Black Americans are like that. If it's not Black, if it's not a Black ancestor, it's not really family. And I think it's so sad. It's so insular. It's so myopic. It's so it denies you the richness of who you are as a person, right? Because we're all parts of many things. You're not 100% African. No, you're probably 70% or 50% or 80%. But there's other stuff there too that's part of who you are genetically. So, final point, and I'll stop talking because I could talk all day long. When I shared my discoveries with one of my sons, he said to me in all seriousness, well, you know, Dad, the only real Twymans are Black Twymans. And I thought that was so silly because we know the Twyman name originated from an English teenager who migrated from Kent, England to Middlesex County, Virginia in 1677. But he feels that way because that's all he has known in terms of the Twyman family and Twyman name, even though half of Twymans in this country are Black and half are white. I have no problem being friends with anyone, regardless of race, but I think sadly, part of the structure of being in Black culture and consciousness is a denial and refusal to accept that one is of mixed heritage. That's what I think. I could be wrong. I'm just one person, right? I'm just one person. And you could argue that my views and my personality are so outlier, right, that it renders me inauthentic. That my views are so open-minded I must have a false consciousness. That my curiosity about the larger world is so bizarre that I must have a false consciousness. What kind of Black American celebrates Boris Pastor? what kind of Black American revels in the fact that he's a second cousin of George Washington? I mean, I don't know. That's why I think it's ultimately personality. I think if more people were like this, we would have fewer racial divisions. That's what I think. That's what I think.
You know, I want to say, like, on that point, Wink, or touching on that point at least, I saw Izabella's answer in her piece, The American Soviet Mentality, where I think that some people come to the collective because it's just easier. And you mentioned this earlier. It's just easier. It's just easier to be quiet. But some people choose to be part of the collective. And Izabella, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, but they choose to be part of the collective because it brings them certain benefits to be part of the collective, or perceived benefits. And so I wonder, in this conversation between you and Izabella on reconciliation, if one of the things we have to reconcile is those who choose, or maybe those who don't even want to reconcile because they choose the benefits of the collective, with those who are accidentally a part of the collective because it's just easier. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, gosh, there's so much in this. There's so much in this.
Which will rise to the occasion.
Well, yeah, I mean, Wink, what you were saying was so interesting for me because it's a real kind of learning moment for me because it's not necessarily something I was really aware of.
That's
Because
right, because in Russia you had Alexander Pushkin, the father of Russian literature, right? Right. So being black is a different thing in Russia.
Well, that's exactly correct. I mean,
Right.
that's a whole separate
Right.
story. Yeah, absolutely. The Black experience in Russia, because we didn't have a lot of Black people, and most who came were, in my lifetime, they were mostly students who came from African countries to study in the Soviet Union and Moscow, and then kind of go back and bring the kind of the socialist ideas to their country. So that was the idea. But certainly, I mean, certainly it was in that sense. I mean, the Soviet Union was a very racist society. I have to say, you know, even though the government brought the students in, I think on a cultural level, it was just painful to even think about it. I have to say, just the attitudes that they were subjected to a lot of times. But I think as I was listening to you, what I was struck with is when you were talking about your affinity with Jennifer, and you said, well, on the first on first thought would be, well, what could we have in common? She's white and I'm Black. And I thought, well, what a shame. How is it that we're back to this thinking? And I don't know, maybe this thinking always existed. It just seems that over the past year, we have moved into a kind of this situation where somehow, you know, there are affinity groups by race, right? There's a separate, it's almost like we are moving back into a segregation, like kind of mentally and culturally. And I just find it so regressive and so painful and so much going against everything that I learned in this country, you know, from Martin Luther King, from the civil rights movement. And frankly, it's also, and Jennifer, I realize I'm not really answering your question. I'm sorry. I'm just kind of going on my own tangent.
Let her go. Yes.
Yeah,
yes, yes.
go roll with it.
Pathway.
You know, but I mean, what I have been thinking about and is look, I'm a scholar of the Holocaust. It's one of the things that I study and follow and look into in detail. And how is it that after the race laws, right, after the Nuremberg laws, after the incredible misery and murder that they brought, and after everything that we learned after that, how those laws were completely discredited, everything that we understood about race, how is it that we're getting back to a situation where we're trying to recreate race as something real, as something like almost like a biological? Sometimes it feels like they will deny. I mean, the woke will deny that they're looking at race as a biological thing. But the way they present it effectively, it's like, you know, you are white and therefore you have these characteristics, and you are Black and therefore you have these characteristics. And what a shame it is that we can't just affiliate with one another based on this kind of affinity and personal chemistry as we would with just anyone, right? Make friendships based on just how we connect.
So I cannot not ask you about anti-Semitism and wokeness. It's something I'm thinking a lot about. I'm in the process of starting an organization, and I'm working with Jennifer closely on this, Jewish Institute for Liberal Values, and I'm hoping to involve all of you in that. But one of the things that we're looking at is how this critical social justice ideology might give rise to anti-Semitism. And I'm wondering what your thoughts might be on that. I mean, I can share a few of my own, but let's start with you and see what you think about that.
Well, look, it's already, as far as I'm concerned, it is part and parcel of the ideology, because it begins with the demonization of Israel and demonization of Zionism. And kind of a complete misunderstanding of what Zionism is. So it starts there. And there I've written about this as well. there I'm having like parallels every day. It's literally like I'm having a flashback to my Soviet experience, because the Soviet Union developed so many of the concepts that demonize Israel and demonize Zionism that the left today is using. Like this whole, the slogan that Zionism is racism, it literally comes from Soviet propaganda. And so for me, and of course, and I know exactly how anti-Zionist propaganda, especially when it comes, when it's espoused on the political level, right? I mean, you individually can have your own feelings about Israel and Zionism, it doesn't matter to me. But when it becomes politically espoused, as it is by these activist groups, and in fact by some of our elected representatives at this point, it generates anti-Semitism almost automatically, because you can sit and argue till the cows come home that anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism are not the same. But the way it translates to the popular level, especially people who are inclined to think this way anyway, is that they understand that who are Zionists? Zionists are Jews. So if Zionists are bad, then Jews are bad. It's very simple. It's very simple. So it's one example. Another example is when you start classifying Jews as upholding white supremacy. You know what? That's, I mean, first of all, it's completely, it goes against everything that Jewish history, or that we kind of think of ourselves from our history, and that just immediately creates opportunities for anti-Semitism.
Yeah, so I would add a couple, and I'd be curious to get your view on it. One is, and I think it's similar to the last point you just made, is that this idea of white privilege easily gives way to the idea of Jewish privilege. And you're hearing that more and more in the popular discourse about Jewish privilege. And Jewish privilege sounds awful much alike the tropes of the traditional anti-Semitic right, which accuses Jews of having disproportionate power. Another way, and might not be anti-Semitism in intent, but anti-Semitism in effect, is that Jews tend to be part of the Democratic Party. And just like in the UK, where you saw Corbyn's effect on the Labour Party, if the Democratic Party becomes a hostile environment for many Jews, particularly those that support Israel, it might lead to sort of mass disenfranchisement of American Jews from politics. I think that's another potential fact. A third is that this new concept of equity, and I support certain aspects of it. I mean, I'm not opposed to certain kinds of affirmative action but this equity in the here and now, that we must have massive changes in the here and now, and that can really disenfranchise people who have made careers, including many Jews and Asian Americans and others who might be disproportionately represented in the political system, in the corporate world, in the universities. I worry about that too, that might not be intentional, but it would lead to really bad effects for the Jewish community. And the last aspect of it is enlightened rationalist societies have been very good for Jews over the years. I mean, and those that are not have not been so good for Jews. So I'm looking to build. I'm looking to hear other angles, and I appreciate you going into the anti-Zionism aspects of this. I mean, wokeness is not inherently, it seems to me, anti-Zionist, but many of the advocates, because of sort of the intersectional connections, tend to be anti-Zionist, and I think that's a real problem for the Jewish community. And I think, and what worries me so much is that the Jewish community has not really thought this through. I mean, there are people, of course, who have, but the Jewish community is sort of slouching into wokeness because they want to so desperately, I want to so desperately be in allyship with the Black community. It's so core to our identity from the civil rights era. We see ourselves, every Jewish kid knows about Goodman and Schwerner, who lost their lives in the civil rights movement. We all know about Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel walking arm in arm with Martin Luther King in the civil rights movement. That's part of our core identity. So it's natural that when the civil rights movement of our time, Black Lives Matter, comes into the mix, and I know that maybe you don't might not agree with that characterization, but it's
Sure,
certainly
no problem.
how it's seen.
I'll talk.
Yeah, you'll talk. You'll correct me on that one. But it's natural for us to want to be part of that. And actually, anybody who knows me knows I was the head of a national Jewish advocacy organization, and I've been involved in certain issues like progressive issues like police reform and criminal justice reform for a long time. And I wanted to connect with the Black Lives Matter movement, with the activists, but I didn't want to sell out ideologically. I didn't want to have to say that America is a white supremacist state in order to be part of that. And I fear that that's the problem here, is that there's an ideological litmus test that's been placed in a way that would have been unthinkable in the 1960s, at least with mainstream civil rights leaders. And so that's why the Jewish community, I think, has to hit the pause button and ask themselves, is this really the right way for us to engage in fixing and repairing America? And so that's my soapbox for a moment.
If I can jump in for a moment, I think, and this is something Jen and I have written about before, the dead hand of Daniel Brown and the issue of allyship. I think allyship is a ancillary. It's kind of beside the point. I think friendship, being friends with people, is more important than allyship. One of the things that occurred in my life, which I think was a very positive good, was in college, I sought out the most intelligent students I could find to be my roommates, because I figured if you're around very smart people, you'll be inspired to do more than you would otherwise. And so it just so happened most of my roommates in college and law school were Jewish Americans. And I think that was great. I think it was great because I learned I just learned that people are people, to put it that way. And they learned the same thing. When I was in law school, I joke with my son. My son belongs to a Black fraternity, Alpha Kappa Alpha, one of the most prestigious in the country. I do not belong to a fraternity, but I often joke with my son and tell him, well, my fraternity experience was I lived in the Sammy house at UPenn. And for those who don't know, Sammy is a Jewish fraternity. Had a great time. My roommate had been the president of Sammy when he was at UPenn. Those kind of intimate connections and relationships, I think, do far more to reduce the sense of the other and division than whether or not one is an ally or not. One could be an ally, but that presumes some type of ongoing battle and war and hostility. If you're a friend, that implies an intimacy, which I think is more enduring and sustainable.
Yeah.
So
beautiful.
Yeah. That's my take.
People demean that friendship. Sometimes they'll say, "Oh, so you're one of those people who says your best friends are Black or your best friends are Jewish." And I think we ought to go back to that to a degree. Yes, some of my best friends are Black because I actually made an effort to get to know people who are different than me.
Yeah.
And that enriched me and it enriched them in the process. And why shouldn't we cite that as a badge of honor?
They were my wedding. My college roommates were in my wedding, law school roommates. So it's all good. It's all good. But
I agree.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead, Wink. Go ahead.
Yeah, but I saw it at UVA. I saw it. Very smart Black kids who I was friends with. They went into a default mode and they only reached out to and considered other Black students as their roommates. And that's fine. That's fine. But it just seems like they never got out of their bubble, their echo chamber. You learn more when you're living with people unlike yourself. And that's just the way I'm hardwired. I really am. I think that it was a blessing for me to grow up in the 1970s because I had a chance to attend desegregated schools, which, from day one, you're outside of your bubble. My junior high school was 3% Black. My high school was 8% Black. And I became a student leader, winning every office I ran for, except for the one in 7th grade. And I think that was good for me because I learned to develop a sense of self, of confidence and ambition in a larger world. It was good for my classmates who may have been raised in all white prejudiced homes and had never really interacted with a Black student as an equal before. They're just innumerable good that comes out of knowing people outside of your echo chamber, outside of your bubble. And yet, I think it's personality because I can tell you in my family, there's so many associations that are just black based. There's
We must have grown
alpha.
up around this.
Go
We
ahead.
must have grown up around the same time, Wink, because I grew up in Columbus, Ohio, in the
Okay.
1970s and 80s.
Okay.
And when I was in fifth grade, they announced that a local judge had made the decision in Columbus to desegregate schools. And I grew up in almost exclusively white school, elementary school, and then was all of a sudden, and when I was in junior high school, and then high school in a very mixed school. And the interesting thing was there was still incredible desegregation in my high school. I mean, you would see there were all black tables and all white tables.
Right.
And you could look at that and say, okay, well, the desegregation experience or the integration experience failed. But the truth was that when I was in sixth grade, and I'll never forget this, I was sitting at a table where there were two black kids at the table. And they happened to be kids who were brought in for like a learning behavioral disability program. So they were not kids who were in the neighborhood area. And I remember being afraid to talk about the color black because I might offend them. I had that little experience talking to black students, black friends. And through seventh grade and eighth grade, I made friends. I mean, yes, there were a lot of separate tables, but over time, I made friends. And it changed the way I understood myself and my relationship to the black community because of that experience, even though it was still segregated. And I know that there's we had a conversation on Clubhouse that there's still a lot of opposition to integration in the black community and that it had an ill effect on the black community. And that may be true. And I don't dismiss those concerns, but I'm just saying for me, the opportunity of integration changed my life.
Oh, 1,000%, David. I agree. 1,000%. I can't imagine my life otherwise. And that's why, circling back to the 1619 Project, that's why I feel I'm not there. I feel like the 1619 Project doesn't see my life, which really began in 1961, doubly so in 1969 and 70 when schools were desegregated. I don't see that. I see slaves. I see slavery and slavers. I know that happened. We all know that happened. I think one of the blessings in the 1970s in my county was that we all knew, we were aware of the evil past. But our mission in life, our duty, was to create a better future. And so we were future oriented. I told Jen I've thought more about slavery in the past 3 years than I did growing up. Having grown up in Richmond, Virginia. Why is that? Whose interest is served by making black people think about past evils over and over and over? It's like Yugoslavia. It's like the Balkans. It's like you have political interests that want to gin up divisions for the political gain. And that's not really the way you make enduring change. You make enduring change when you know your player on the football team of a different race. You make enduring change when you're campaigning for political office before a class that is 97% white. You make enduring change when you resist the tribal urge to go to the black college down the street and you go to the University of Virginia in Charlottesville. You make enduring change when you tell your dad, I'm not going to go to Howard Law School, I'm going to go to Harvard Law School because that opens up more opportunities in life. You make enduring change when you choose your closest friends and pals because you connect, not because your skin color is the same. That's how you make enduring change. That's what I think.
That's so powerful what you just said, and I was reading one of your articles earlier today where you describe, I think you talk about your roommate situation. You talk about how students in the cafeteria, black students were sitting at a separate table, and it brought back a memory. I also went to Harvard School I got my master's degree there.
Go Princeton.
So, and I remember, it was just a few years into my living in the US, and I really wasn't aware of any of these issues. But I remember I walked into the cafeteria and I saw that there was a kind of separate table for black students. And I just remember feeling kind of like wow, what a pity. Like I would have loved to talk to them, but I don't feel that I can join their table. It seems like they want to just sit together. And it felt like a real missed opportunity, So that, I mean, I'm very much with you about just making friends of
Yeah.
all races, all backgrounds, and I think these separations are also now coming into the Jewish community, coming back for a moment to that issue, the idea that that there are white Jews and then there are Jews of color, and that we're separate and different, and I don't want to diminish the experience of Jews of color for sure, and it sounds like there are some very bad experiences that Black Jews sometimes feel unwelcome in synagogues, and that's just unacceptable. That has to be fixed, absolutely. And it's devastating to know this. But to try to divide us this way, I mean, it's just it doesn't serve the Jewish people for sure to agree to be divided that way. And in fact,
Yes.
David, as you were talking, I thought about how already, I don't know if you saw this a few days ago, there was on social media, there were some reports of how on Clubhouse, a few groups had to be shut down because there was some anti-Semitic talk, including conversations about, well, these white Jews kind of like acting the way white Jews would, So you could see how that label is starting to use by people. It's almost like a permitted use anti-Semitic. It's like there are some things that people have learned that they can't say, right? The anti-Semites, but to like denigrate a white Jew is now permitted. So I think it's all very, very
It's collective condemnation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. It's so funny because in doing the family history research, I really discovered I'm a part of such a large universe of people. You mentioned Black Jews. My maternal haplogroup is L2A1, and that may not mean anything to you, but actually it's a maternal haplogroup which originated, I believe, with a Jewish woman about 2,000 years ago. And so that that maternal haplogroup has gone down through the centuries to me. So in a sense, knowing that made me feel closer to Jewish Americans, because at least I know that my mother's 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 mother for 20 or 30 generations was a Jewish woman from the Middle East. So,
wow, amazing story.
So I'm gonna take us back to this idea of the collective. I'm almost done with my drink, but there's a couple of things I want to tie up here. I mean, I love, Wink, what you were just saying, because I think when we see ourselves in others, whether that's through ancestry, which is your big thing, and seeing that you actually are related to the Jewish population. When you see yourself in others, you kind of break down the collective. It's not as easy to do anymore. But we are at a place, and Isabel, what I found so interesting, and I can't speak from the Black American experience, I can't speak from the Jewish experience, where I can speak from and where I saw so much that I identified in some of your work is I do study China. And much like the Soviet Union, there is this kind of collective attitude that is very dangerous to break out of. And we saw the whole Cultural Revolution, as a result of that collective. And what I worry about is what I see happening in America. And Wink and I have written on this as well. A lot of it is akin to what I saw and what I could relate to in my studies of the Cultural Revolution, which again, I know is distinct and different from the Soviet Union, but there is what is similar is that idea of the overall collective. And either you either choose to go along to get along, or you choose to go along because it's of benefit to you. Either way, the collective becomes the dominant narrative. And that is what worries me the most about what we're seeing in America. So if you could end us on what are your biggest concerns, given your research and your study of Soviet history and everything that we've talked about here, of where we're going, and maybe what inspiration do you have that we might not end up in the same position as a Chinese Cultural Revolution or a Soviet Union type revolution?
Well, look, what I would say, and this is actually a thought that Natan Sharansky, who is this great Jewish dissident, Soviet dissident, who really fought the Soviet system and fought on behalf of Jewish people, on behalf of Soviet Jewry. This is a thought that he kind of puts forth quite a bit, that we each have to find our inner courage to speak up. It doesn't have to be all the time. Like you were saying, we can't always, we have to sometimes pick and choose our battles. There are instances that I know of that I actually blame myself for not saying something, for just going along with the crowd. Of course, look, we have to be forgiving of ourselves too, but we have to start discovering our inner courage, and we have to start learning to go against it. I think that, look, there's any number of examples from history when the crowd is just not going with the crowd is just not right. Like, for example, in the Holocaust, the question of collaboration or just standing by and not intervening, it can lead to real evil, right? Into you supporting real evil. So we all, I think, need to define our values, and we need to understand where we have to value our own voice, and we have to bring it out and speak up. And as for inspiration, I mean, look, I think that it's all in the American founding documents. I think that the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, I don't know, it may sound too simple, but I think it's all there. I think these are extraordinary documents that no other nation has. And I do think that America, it's an imperfect country, but I do still think of America as a shining city on a hill. And I think that to me, look, the Statue of Liberty, all of these things, it's all here. We have the inspiration right here. We just have to be reminding ourselves of it.
The idea is always to form a more perfect union, I think.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. There's a great phrase that they use about Israel, and I think it also applies to America. America is both a work in progress and a work of progress. And I think that's, we should keep that in mind, and balancing both of those is really how to best make change.
That's a great way of putting it.
And I think that's why we chose Isabella's essay as a cautionary tone to the 1619 Project.
Yeah. Well, you guys are also inspirational. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you.
I appreciate the invitation, and I appreciate having made this connection with you, because I think that another thing that's, if I may add one more thing, I think that's really important in this moment is for all of us to find like-minded people, so that we can discuss these things with people. Affinity, right? Like create these affinities that you are talking about. So I really appreciate having had this conversation and all the kind words about the essay. Thank you.
Oh, of course. I mean, I was thinking to myself this morning on my walk, you must have had the muse of the ages on your shoulder when you wrote that piece, because they really, really sing well.
It's one of those things that just, I think, happens like once. There was something in that moment when that parallel came, and I had a lot of worry in my mind, and that just, it came together. So
The light shine forth from within for the benefit of us now living through the darkness of the 1619 Project.
In 2021.
In 2021, that's right.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Hold My Drink. Like or subscribe to the show, and check out the show notes for links to source material and to our website, where you can find what each of us is reading every week, different news with different views. If you have a topic that you would like us to explore, drop us a line. And join us next week as we say, hold my drink, and the conversation gets real.